first have a mini didactic or a micro didactic on schizophrenia. All right, and what causes schizophrenia? So from that perspective, any initial thoughts about what the causes are for the condition called schizophrenia? Generically speaking, we're going to discuss the etiology biopsychosocially. I think for the most part, and certainly what comes up in various forms on shelf exams, on exams, is the biological hypothesis or the dopamine hypothesis. Right? Excess dopamine in the mesolimbic tract causes schizophrenia. And we understood that as early as 1954 when chlorpromazine was FDA approved for the treatment of schizophrenia, knowing that this drug at the time, called hibernotherapy, lowered CNS levels of dopamine, quickly born the dopamine hypothesis. Because many people afflicted with schizophrenia were improved and even deinstitutionalized. So the dopamine hypothesis. Now, in terms of the biological part or the biological factors pertaining to a biopsychosocial formulation of the etiology of schizophrenia, there are other biological markers as well. And there I would just ask you to look into that during quote-unquote independent learning. I'm more interested in the psychosocial component of this as much as it relates to our film. And specifically about the psychological factors that play a major role, because not only are they valid, but they're highly reliable. Very consistently, we see these come together in for lack of a better word, in clusters, and they led to a predictive outcome. And there are three such clustering of signs and symptoms, and they are so reliable that we've been able to label them. One is called the paranoid personality disorder, one is called the schizoid personality disorder, and one is called the schizotypal personality disorder. Psychological factors contributing to the risk of developing schizophrenia. So again, if we think not only biopsychosocially now, but also along the three Ps, predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating factors, these three personality disorders themselves in the cluster A personality disorder classification do pose a risk with regard to the predisposing to schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. All right, so a very brief overview, microdidactic, on the etiology of schizophrenia. Now we can talk about the film. All right, so first and foremost, and I think we've done this, so I would think, I'm pretty sure we've done this, maybe I'm wrong. Who here could name me the personality disorders? Name me all of them, you walk out of this room immediately with honors. Your clerkship's over, okay? Your month is over as a resident. Okay. Miss one, and you are going to remediate your M2 year. Right, so who's up for the challenge?
I don't know if that's worth the risk.
Huh? Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, if I asked you to recite the alphabet, you'd take it. But unfortunately, naming the personality disorders is something that usually, on average, I may get one out of a clerkship to say they would take the challenge. And then and I never ask them to, but they often want to. And those that want to, which of course now is an incredible selection bias, 50-50, right? So the real tell here is that there's some deficit in the person that provided you the personality disorders intro when you were in M2 during neuron, brain, and behavior. And I know that because that was me. So this comes full circle today. And I've been recognizing this for well over a decade, really almost 2 decades now. I can't point the finger at you because you were my students only a year ago during that NDD presentation. So I know there's a consistent variable here beyond you. And I've got to look in the mirror about this. So a little while ago, I came up with the idea, kind of stumbled upon it, that these personality disorders, at least the 7 remaining ones that fill clusters B and C, have a nice linkage to the 7 deadly sins. And a unique way, a novel way maybe of reviewing and learning the personality disorders is taking it into 2 parts. The first part is convincing you that the cluster A personality disorders are not personality disorders per se, but prodromes to schizophrenia, hence our microdidactic. The second part would be to piggyback the 7 deadly sins and match the personality disorder with each of those. So if you watch 7, and if you could rattle off the 7 deadly sins, you have rattled off the 7 remaining personality disorders, right? And I think more than 0 of you then would raise your hand in naming the 7 deadly sins, hence our discussion to follow. So, what deadly sin does this film start out with? What's the initial discovery? Gluttony. All right, so a trick question is coming up, but actually let me actually ask. Trick question, what is gluttony?
Overeating or overindulging.
Overeating or overindulging. So that's usually the way gluttony manifests, but it's not truly gluttony. Anybody have any idea what gluttony really is?
So it's like a lack of behavior control or impulse control?
Lack of behavior control. It's consistent. But what's the initial insult? The initial insult is turning your back on who or what is important. Because once you do that, where you are then facing is in the material, food and drink. And that is what results in gluttonous behavior. But the initial insult is turning your back on who or what is important. Right. Now again, this is born out of Catholicism and Christianity, so the who is going to be God. And when you turn your back on the Lord, you are facing the material, food and drink as an example. That's gluttony. It's gluttonous. And then a lot of religious books will look at civilizations that were gluttonous and their fall, ultimately, because of their gluttony. Right? And from a historical perspective, that would have, of course, included, but it's not limited to the Roman Empire. Right? So that's the main idea of gluttony. Brief, very brief, 20 words or less, world history lesson as well, like gluttony. If gluttony is defined as, or at least the initial insult is the turning of one's back on what or who is important, what is the psychological term that is the equivalent to that in our field?
Reaction formation?
Reaction formation? No, that's more of a defense mechanism. I get what you're saying. Reaction formation is an unconscious process that does result in a behavior that is opposite to its impulse.
Is it more just the emphasis of like the id, like the basic impulses, as opposed to like turning your back on the super ego control mechanisms?
So yeah, it's the id. It is an id impulse, or at least it's implicated in the pleasure principle of the id, which is are the impulsive activities or the impulses of the id. The psychological term is called egocentrism. Egocentrism. Individuals, because they are bound by the id when we are first born, operate along the pleasure principle. We only want to fill our most physiologic or biological drives. Here, I'm actually merging Maslow's triangle with that of Sigmund Freud's theory. Okay, so that's the id. That's the pleasure principle that drives us, that motivates our behavior. At some point, though, we are made to consider others. And that's a process. It doesn't come easy. And during this time, and at the initial time is probably around the age of 2, aka the terrible 2s, because the process is a little rocky. The individual is made to consider others and their behaviors and their actions, etc. And when they do, they often will begin to develop empathy. Empathy simply defined as one's capacity to view a situation from one's perspective other than their own. Right? The opposite of egocentrism. So the path has been altered. What usually alters this path is called, at least by Kohut, another theorist, healthy infantile narcissism. otherwise known as self-esteem. Once we have self-love, we have the capacity to love others. And now the path can derail from egocentrism more toward empathy and then ultimately towards compassion. However, if the individual does not have self-love, if the individual does not have healthy infantile or childhood narcissism, then they may remain egocentric, always searching for that healthy infantile narcissism, even if they're age inappropriate, now they're 10 or 20 or 30. Okay, so that's the general idea with regard to developmental theory behind egocentrism and therefore gluttony. John of Beverly, anybody here know this fable? John of Beverly is a hermit, probably a schizoid personality, visited by God. God tells John of Beverly that you must be inflicted with either anger / wrath, gluttony, or lust. Must pick one. We're going to go in, we'll go in clockwise order. Everybody's going to get kicked out. Nobody's on camera. Say it loud. Anger, lust, or gluttony.
Anger.
You would choose anger.
Lust.
Lust.
Gluttony.
Hold on one second, wait. Anger, lust, gluttony. We have one anger. We have one anger. We have
One lust.
one lust, and we have one gluttony.
Lust.
Lust,
You're gonna just anger.
anger,
Anger.
anger,
Lust.
lust,
Lust.
lust,
Anger.
anger. This is an interesting group. Who chose gluttony? So John Beverly chooses gluttony. I'm not going to turn the camera around. We have one student choose gluttony. John of Beverly's logic here was that all these three are deadly sins. Anger and lust can harm someone. Gluttony, I'm likely to harm myself. I'd rather harm myself than bring harm unto others. So he chooses gluttony. You chose gluttony. You are a noble man.
But I thought, I don't know, I think with lust you don't necessarily harm somebody else.
I'm not going to go there. we have some
You can keep that
rationalization.
contained.
We have 4 to 1. Well, here's what's happened. So this fable ends with John of Beverly becoming gluttonous, alcoholic, comes home one night acutely intoxicated, and he walks into his sister's bedroom, and he crawls in bed with his sister, and he begins to rape his sister. His father hears the screams, runs into the room, and in a fit of rage, anger, he kills his father. All right, so
Yeah.
exactly right. Gluttony is a gateway sin. And it's very interesting that it's the opening scene, at least the opening murder in this movie we're about to discuss, because it fits perfect with the fable and really the moral of John of Beverly. Similarly, egocentrism is a gateway as well. Right? So egocentrism equals gluttony. Both are gateways. Gluttony is the gateway to the other deadly sins and the opening crime in David Fincher 7. Egocentrism is a gateway to develop the personality disorders that are categorized in clusters B and C. All right. Who wants to name me a deadly sin? Oh, shoot. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we're going to split right there. We're going to put the resident on the short team. Team A to my left. Team B here to the right. Team A goes first. You are going to tell Team B either a personality disorder or a deadly sin, and you've got to give the associated other. All right? So we'll play for points. So Team A is up first, and that you have to give the challenge to Team B. So pick one.
Borderline.
Sorry?
Borderline.
Borderline personality disorder. What deadly sin characterizes the borderline personality disorder of Team B?
Gosh, I wasn't going to get this. I think it's lust, right?
Well, let's see, there's not wrath, right? Not gluttony. Lust.
5 seconds.
It doesn't even up, but
Do you wanna
it's
do-
7.
Keep that in mind. You're on this. Keep that in mind.
Wrath.
That's too much.
Final answer?
Wrath.
Wrath is correct.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Anger is literally a diagnostic criterion of the borderline personality disorder. Anger or wrath is the deadly sin. Team B gains a point. Team B, give either or to Team A.
Sure, yeah.
All right, we're gonna give them avoidant personality disorder.
Avoidant personality disorder. Team A, avoidant personality disorder.
I feel like that's
Pride?
envy. I think that's envy. Because
Oh.
you want relationships, but you don't get them.
Maybe.
5 seconds.
But in the morning, also like hypersensitive to negative.
But that's narcissism. Pride is narcissism.
You
Yeah,
can
you're
answer.
probably right, yeah.
Envy?
All right.
Envy is incorrect. Avoidant personality is sloth. Is sloth.
Oh, I can see that. I forgot about
You can
that.
see. All right.
I feel like I know the personality disorders better than the.
Team A, challenge Team B. You're up.
Schizotypal.
That's a cluster A.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
we just took,
Yeah.
obsessive compulsive.
Obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Team B. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Give me the deadly sin.
Or pride.
I guess I think pride would be more narcissism. Right?
5 seconds.
I think it's great.
You need an answer?
Okay.
Agreed.
Greed is correct. Team B gets it right. One of the diagnostic criteria of the obsessive compulsive personality is that the individuals may actually be frugal and have a miserly spending style. So greed. It's actually a diagnostic criteria. They don't use the G word, but certainly describes greed. All right, Team B. Challenge Team A.
I can't hear you. What?
You could give them either a deadly sin or a personality disorder.
Yeah.
We do pride.
Do you guys?
Oh no, let's see. We did wrath. Did we do wrath?
Borderline, avoidant, and obsessive compulsive personality have been taken.
Wow. Which one's next? We did last. We haven't done that one.
Envy.
Haven't done envy.
Envy to Team A.
I feel like that one has to be narcissism.
5 seconds.
He's trying to one up them.
Or history on it.
I need an answer.
I was wrong last time, so. I think it's narcissistic.
I thought it was narcissistic too.
Because
Okay.
you're always trying to be the
Narcissistic
center.
is correct. Envy is actually a diagnostic criteria. Is envious of others or believes others are envious of him. And they actually use that pronoun. Yeah. So envy is the narcissistic personality. Team A gets the point. Team A challenge Team B. We have 3 more to go.
So the ones we have left are history, right? Antisocial. And histrionic.
Let's go with histrionic.
Yeah, history, I feel like that one's pretty.
Histrionic personality disorder.
That's pretty lost, right?
I think it's
Like,
pride.
being hypersexual. Yeah. it's
5
lost.
seconds.
Yeah, I think it's lost.
Well, with pride, it's like trying to become in like.
But history, I think, does have like hypersexual.
Yeah, so I
stuff
think
as
it's less.
criteria. Yeah.
I mean, I'm gonna say pride, but you can say less.
Okay. I'm gonna defer to you.
I say lost. All right, lost.
Need an answer?
Lost.
It's actually pride.
Oh.
It is pride.
This is our chance to.
So, Team B, challenge Team A. We're still at 2 to 1.
You guys.
It's like personality disorder. Yeah.
Antisocial. I don't remember the last one. It's like antisocial.
The other one's dependent.
Dependent.
Dependent, okay.
We just do dependent.
Let's give them dependent.
Yeah.
Now, this is for 2 points.
Is there 2 answers? Is that one?
not going to give any more than I already have.
Dependent.
What do we have left? So we've done so far wrath, sloth, envy, greed, and pride.
So I will say that it's 2 points because it's a little tricky.
Is it none? So we have gluttony and
Dull.
we just have gluttony and pride, right?
Wait, no, we did.
Histrionic is pride.
Yeah,
We have
yeah.
lust and gluttony.
Lust,
Lust,
yeah.
and gluttony.
Now, gluttony's already been taken. It's the gateway.
Oh.
So lust is the only one left.
So it's a little tricky, which is why it's 2 points.
Maybe it could be a repeat.
Here we go.
Is it greed because they want people to do everything? So like they depend on someone to do something?
5 seconds.
I would go envy.
Envy?
Yeah.
Sloth.
Sloth.
Sloth. Yeah, I want to see sloth.
Give me an answer.
Sloth.
Sloth is correct for 2 points. You take the lead. Unfortunately, there's only one left, and that is the dependent personality, and there's only one deadly sin left, which is what? I'm sorry, not dependent. The antisocial personality. And there's only one deadly sin, which is lust. So we are actually in a tie. How about that?
Well done.
Everybody's happy. There are 2 forms of sloth. One is called acedia, and the other one is called tristidia. Acedia is the form of sloth in which the individual has the perspective of, I don't want to be bothered. Right? That's the avoidant personality. Tristidia is more of why bother? Why bother? It's only going to happen anyway. That's learned helplessness, feeling that you don't have any control over your actions and behavior. That's dependent, getting you ready to do something for you. Why bother? Right? So it's a little different. Both are sloth. Hence, sloth counts for both the dependent as well as the avoidant personality disorders. Acedia, avoidant. Tristidia, dependent personality. 2 forms of sloth. It does account for the fact that we use gluttony as the gateway, and it evens things up, okay, in terms of the 7 deadly sins. All right. So this movie certainly provides a little bit of an overview or discussion in being able to identify the 7 deadly sins, and therefore the 7 personality disorders that actually then are categorized in clusters B and C. Beyond that, it also allows for a peek into these characters and to discuss what we think may be going on in the main characters in the film. So, any particular character you would like to start with?
I think John Doe.
So, John Doe.
Sure.
So what are your observations on John Doe? What interested you?
So I guess like thinking about it, so I guess I was kind of struggling in terms of a diagnosis for him, because on one hand I was thinking about antisocial personality disorder, like he has like a lot of murders. It seems like he has like little regard for the law, but then he's also kind of like religiously preoccupied, and so it seems like he has some sense of morality, which is kind of like driving his murders. So I was like thinking about like the antisocial personality disorder versus like psychopathy, I guess, because that's not a part of like the DSM, versus like maybe schizophrenia or like a bipolar type of picture where he's like religiously preoccupied, which is like driving him to like do all these things. So I don't know if it's like a psychosis that's kind of driving him to like want to murder the people, or underlying like mood components. Those was kind of like the differential I had in my head.
Yeah. I don't think any of us can argue that John Doe personifies a blatant disregard for and violation of others' rights. Therefore, John Doe personifies the cardinal trait of the antisocial personality disorder. Right? So that's got to be very high on our differential, because the whole movie is about a serial killer. It's really hard to sidestep that here. We did address this a bit this morning with regard to the diagnosis, the illness called antisocial personality disorder, in that it is a diagnostic term used in psychiatry. That is not the case for a psychopath or psychopathy. Psychopathy is not a diagnostic term, it's a clinical term we use to describe behavior. And it describes behavior that the consensus is a more severe variant of the antisocial personality disorder. if we were to get a better understanding of this illness pertaining to John Doe, we would want to take a developmental history. We would want to or need to understand whether there was evidence of conduct disorder prior to the age of 15. If there was, that would certainly support a diagnosis of the antisocial personality disorder. Any cruelty to animals, oppositional, defiant behavior with regard to truancy towards authority, etc. Destruction of property, including but not limited to fire setting. Conduct disorder. In the absence of that, it's going to be hard for us to justify the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder because the diagnosis requires the evidence of conduct. In such cases, we may substitute the clinical term of psychopathy. What further complicates this is that he appears to be delusional. He operates upon a fixed belief that he's doing God's work. And as such, may have another axis 1 psychopathology. And here, the differential likely would be psychosis within a bipolar spectrum disorder versus a baseline psychotic disorder ruled out schizophrenia. And if established, then we have to wonder whether or not the antisocial traits are due to the primary illness or whether there's a co-occurring personality disorder, rule out antisocial personality. And the only way we really get to know this is in the prequel, which doesn't exist. Right? The prequel, or at least in a slice of time called 7, when this movie premiered, talking to a collateral, mother, father, sister, brother, would give us the history. We don't have that either. And Fincher really doesn't put anything in the script that sheds any light that this is a primary axis 1 pathology, bipolar versus schizophrenia, or that the film 7 pertaining to John Doe is about the antisocial personality. So, but that's the case formulation. Any other observations with regard to John Doe other than what fits into that cardinal trait of blatant disregard for and violation of others' rights?
He also admits that he is envy at the end.
Yeah. Which is wonderful, because none of us would be able to dismiss that he's also a narcissist. Now again, is that narcissism part of the grandiosity defining a manic episode? Is it part of his bipolar 1 illness? Or does it operate outside of the axis 1 pathology, the bipolar or related disorder, and therefore result in another diagnosis, an axis 2, which would be, in addition to the antisocial personality, the narcissistic personality disorder. And that shouldn't surprise anybody because, again, these cluster. So it's no surprise that these two cluster D personalities are going to cluster, or perhaps cluster, and maybe co-diagnosed, maybe comorbid.
So similar to like Sarah's point as well, I was trying to piece through this idea of like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, because like watching it now, having discussed the things we've talked about previously, I would watch him and could totally believe grandiosity from him. If he had off-scene filming, like hearing voices in his head from God telling him to do this work, for example, struck me as like, there has to be some sort of component of mania, like the amount of effort required to do all of this stuff. Pretty much be around or awake at all times to like accomplish all these complex straps. I think at one point, he was taking a picture of the sloth victim every single day, or like the gluttony patient that he was like feeding over and over and over, had to go outside and buy more food to feed him again. Like there doesn't seem to be a lot of like sleep or break from this.
It does go on for so long though, like with the sloth, you know, this has been in the works for over a year. So I wonder about like the length that a manic episode would have to take on.
So the average length of a manic episode, so the magic number for mania is 7, right? That's the magic number, the threshold number for diagnosis, but if you look at the literature, the average manic episode is really measured in months, 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
He would have had to have been manic for a full year, which is possible, especially if there's a co-occurring use of drugs, stimulants, which Fincher doesn't give us any indication of course. But that's a good point. That kind of weighs against mania. So there's definitely goal-directed behavior, there's no doubt about that. And it certainly appears to have been a decreased need for sleep. But on the other hand, logistically,
I was thinking like the paranoid type schizophrenia, possibly. Like he's pretty high functioning. I mean, granted, outside of normal rules, but he gets a lot of stuff done. They say that he's like probably well educated. So I'm wondering if maybe like he could have been like even more functioning like in his earlier years, like through college or something. And then this was a later onset. And like, I mean, he obviously has a major preoccupation with the delusion that God has this plan for him and, you know, all of this.
yeah. So again, schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders is a chapter in the DSM. In schizophrenia, to your point, individuals with a high level of premorbid functioning have a more relatively favorable diagnosis and prognosis. That might be what's going on here. So, and if not, it at least allows us to talk about or identify the risk factors with regard to prognostic factors. And premorbid functioning is significant there. And David Fincher does actually give us that. It's an interesting observation. But we have to consider other psychotic disorders as well. If there are not the cognitive deficits that do define schizophrenia, why not delusional disorder? But then again, we're still in the same place because we wouldn't diagnose even delusional disorder if we decided that those delusions operate within a manic episode. Mm-hmm. So we're still going to have to struggle with the length of time he spent with with gluttony, and the average length of a manic episode being 3 to 6 months. So a lot for discussion here. Again, antisocial personality, narcissistic personality, definitely. There is evidence of psychosis, whether it's a primary psychotic disorder versus a mood disorder with psychotic features. We need more information. We need the prequel. So somebody get on the phone with David Fincher and get these comments. And he's going to need somebody to co-produce. So I think this group would be wonderful.
Don't we forget the credit.
Only if you.
We need the credit.
Of course, well, you know, we find print at the bottom. But we would just call ourselves a certain group. Good to go.
I found it interesting that he shared a lot of views about the city as Somerset. He kind of said that the city was when they were in the car with Somerset, he was saying that the city was hopeless, and you know he had such a bad outlook on them, and he needs to like do this thing to teach them, and that was kind of the reason why Somerset was leaving because he had similar ideas.
Well, I was thinking with Somerset, maybe, you know, depression, because he is like hopeless and a bit apathetic. Like the way that those like base thoughts like developed were so different between the two of them. But yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
there was some similarity there.
So let's
And
switch
also
over.
like with Morgan Freeman's character Somerset, like it showed him like sleep disturbance, like how he was like going at night and like throwing the knives because he couldn't sleep. Stuff like that.
Let's talk about Somerset now. So certainly there is a nice parallel between how each view the world. Somerset at the end renders the opinion that it's worth saving, which seems to me that he wants to distance himself from John Doe. But your point's well taken.
Well, what I also found interesting was that, like, at the beginning, Somerset, I think, didn't see the world as worth saving, but if anything, he, like, wanted more, like, the hermit reaction to it. Like, he's like, oh, I'll just give up on them and just do my own thing. And then it was at the end, he kind of saw it as worth saving. Even though I do think also that John Doe saw it as worth saving as well, because he just thought that like the way to save it is to teach everybody this big lesson.
Right.
So I think the interesting parallel with all of that is that both of them, again, don't see it as like a good place right now. Like even Somerset at the end doesn't describe it as like a fine place, but it's still worth saving. So they both agree with that. But then you get like David Mills and his family, which seem a little bit more like upbeat or positive about everything, is like the foil to to it because they like live in a terrible apartment, but they seem happy. They have dogs. They're like.
No, I wouldn't say they seem happy.
I think so. I mean, like, you know, they have the job. Like, they can handle like this large train coming through, but certainly like a more optimistic outlook of the whole world compared to those two.
Yeah, I feel like they were upset about like the train coming through until Somerset like started laughing, and then they joined in. But before that, like you could see the like anger
Sure.
issues going on in him.
What's the anger? What was that look in each of their eyes when the train did come through? Anybody pick up on that? What were they really emoting there?
The frustration
Like
about like their
disappointment.
state of life.
I
More
think they felt
specific?
deceived too, because they had like
Yeah.
only been to the apartment for like 5 minutes before signing down on it, so they felt like they were kind of deceived.
How did that happen?
The real estate guy was a piece of crap.
Sorry?
The real estate guy was like a piece of crap.
Well, it's projection.
Took them in
But-
like 5-minute intervals, right, like between the subway.
Well, I think it was just they were like kind of in a rush, you know, like this whole move was for him, and he's just so like, get this done. He acts so impulsively.
They were in a rush?
Well, yeah.
The reaction on their faces had everything to do with their marital problems. He's sick.
Yeah.
He's impulsive. They're in and out 5 minutes was because he said, we're in now, we're out now. And she has basically got to a point where she's had enough. All right, so that look, before they did decide to laugh, only because of Somerset, that look was an absolute kind of summary statement about what she's had to endure and what the relationship is all about. It was in that brief, fleeting moment, and then they break through with a laugh, which again is probably a defense mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that spoke volumes with regard to where this couple is. So if we're done with regard to Somerset, definitely insomnia. Certainly there are there's some belief system here that does seem to be congruent with, of all people, John Doe. He's quitting. He's retiring. And this might actually have been the proverbial final straw, which seems to have been born of his last relationship, which he slowly, let's give us a little glimpse into.
Yeah.
There's certainly co-occurring insomnia, so depressive disorder should not be dismissed. That's probably where we're going to start. But now we're looking at Mills, whose impulsivity is absolutely clinically impaired.
Wait, sorry, I just had one comment
Yeah.
about Somerset. I think he also may be having like underlying PTSD, which may be contributing to like his paranoia and like hypervigilance, maybe also possibly contributing to his insomnia. Like he was very vivid at one point in the movie talking about like the number of times he held someone at gunpoint and he was like fed up with the community. So maybe like from his job it just like there might be some underlying PTSD going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think given his job and given how long he's been at his job and the information that he does provide pertaining to his experience, as well as the co-occurring nature of PTSD and depression, we wouldn't dismiss post-traumatic stress disorder. That has to be in our workup, certainly in our clinical evaluation. So depressive disorder versus PTSD, and again, high comorbidity. So maybe both. Maybe both. Mill? I mean, incredibly impulsive.
Yeah.
Clinically significant. His marriage is going to end.
Well,
Not in a
Well,
sensational
I
way
mean-
that it did end. Nobody really predicted that, but it's going to end.
Well, he also had concerns about infidelity too. Like one point when they were like standing in front of the mirror, he's like, "Oh yeah, if I come home late, my wife's gonna start like questioning me." So maybe there was like possibly infidelity in the past. Like I don't know, the prequel maybe.
I didn't get that vibe. I think, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I would have said that there was probably like a past infidelity issue. I think that he was just like, you know, saying, oh, she's gonna be upset if I'm out this much. Like I think that on a deeper level, he understands that he's not giving her like the attention that she needs. And like even like that last day when like he had a call from her and he just like blew it off. Like as he was walking in right before John Doe presented, they're like, oh, your wife called again. Like you really need to like get a voicemail or something, because clearly he's just ignoring her calls repeatedly. And I don't know. I think it's more of just like the general like the night after they're, you know, like he's with Somerset, and then they go to a bar after work, and then he comes home and she's already asleep. Like, he could have gone straight home, but he didn't.
Or he could have called her.
Or he could have called her.
If he wasn't gonna go straight home.
Something, but he just leaves her there.
This marriage is over. It's only a
Yeah.
matter of time until she leaves him.
Yeah.
This is a flawed character. The impulsivity certainly suggests that very similar to John Doe as well. This may be impulsivity within the context of a mood disorder like mania, or it may be a co-occurring or a primary personality disorder. Right, so we're in that same type of differential, although a little bit different, different chapters of the DSM, if you will. But we're in that same type of differential as we were with, of all people, John Doe. We have a symptom, we have behavior that we identify that is definitely problematic, and it may or may not be in the context of a larger axis 1 psychopathology, or it may be due to a personality disorder, and we just don't quite have all of the information. Impulsivity.
So the diagnosis that kind of stuck out to me with him a lot was intermittent explosive disorder. Like, you could certainly see, I mean, he has a reason for what he did, but I could totally believe it in outside scenes or beforehand, him blowing up, he's thrown things, he's had like very bad arguments, he already like
He opened the door when it could have cost him the investigation.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the intermittent explosive disorder. You know, before 2013, this condition was part of a group of disorders referred to as the impulse control disorders. Again, there's that word impulse. The full name of the chapter, though, was the impulse control disorders not elsewhere classified. And the very title of the chapter reminded us as clinicians that we wouldn't even look into this chapter with regard to diagnoses, which include, but perhaps are not limited to, the intermittent explosive disorder until we could definitively rule out that the impulsivity wasn't due to another disorder. So you only got to that chapter of the impulse control disorders. Again, intermittent explosive is but one example. Other conditions at the time included trichotillomania and kleptomania. Those are two very common examples that do appear on exams. But even then, none of these would be in consideration because we have to make sure they were NEC, not elsewhere classified. So is there a differential? I would keep it low because of all the discussion we previously had. We're still struggling with this character. With regard to Mills, is it a primary mood disorder? Is it a primary personality disorder? If it's neither, then maybe intermittent explosive. But because of the impulsivity that is defining of the antisocial personality, right? Impulsivity, antisocial personality, you're going to have to convince me that his intermittent explosiveness isn't due to his antisocial personality, right? So again,
I also noticed, like, and I don't think that it would actually be like narcissistic personality, but I did notice some little things that would kind of align with that. Like when they're at the bar and Somerset is like, oh, nobody's gonna be thanking you for this. Like you want like the people to like love you for you helping them, and that's like not gonna happen. And like he does seem to want like admiration for his job and like for saving others. He wants to be like really respected and seen as good. And I also think he really does lack empathy. Like what John Doe has a point, that it is so easy for him, and he repeatedly does this, to just like cast people as insane, and therefore he doesn't even have to think about like their motives or emotions. Like, oh, they're just insane, that's all there is to it. Like, I'm not even gonna try to put myself in their shoes and see what they're thinking. And he really lacks empathy for the wife as well, and that like she would have feelings associated with this move or any of that.
He definitely has an incapacity to understand that. Yeah, he definitely is. So, and I don't think, I use it as an example, I don't think Mills has true antisocial personality disorder. Right? Even if he had a history of conduct, I still don't think he meets diagnostic criteria. But the point still remains, until all of this is sorted out, we're going to leave the condition of the intermittent explosive disorder lower in our differential.
Oh,
I was
also
also
with
thinking,
oh, sorry.
for Mills, you mentioned the mood disorder, possibly personality disorder. But I was also thinking in terms of behaviorally, I thought ADHD could be a possibility because he's always on the go, he's impulsive, he's impatient, he's quick to jump to conclusions. And he has a difficulty waiting for his turn, basically. So I
Maybe
thought.
that's why John Doe admires him.
Well, that aspect also I would think of, like, maybe with the narcissism, like, the believing that somebody would be envious of you. Like, at the end, when John Doe says, like, oh, I'm envious of you, I don't think for a second that Mills would question that somebody would be envious of him. Even though his, like, or envious of his marriage, even though his marriage is falling apart. Like, and he just doesn't even see it.
I agree. I agree. I like the idea of ADHD.
Yeah.
Again, it's another example of how we really have to consider a Brodin differential on what was previously known as axis 1 before both intermittent explosive as well as axis 2 pathology. Those would be lower in our differential.
Also with ADHD, like, he gets the SparkNote versions because he can't sit down to, like, read the whole book and maintain that concentration.
Right, and he also makes careless mistakes, and I feel like he kind of goes down the list of people with ADHD, and I thought that's why I thought it was primarily the ADHD that was showing through, rather than maybe he did show lack of empathy. Now I see how that could be interpreted as lack of empathy, but I also kind of took that as also that could be his personality. Maybe it's driven by ADHD that could be projected as looking like he lacks empathy, and that could be interpreted as antisocial.
It would have been nice if Fincher gave us a little bit of a history of why he really transferred forces, and that there was cocaine that went missing on one bus, and because of Mills then would have been a prime candidate to have stolen that to self-medicate. That would have been a nice, congruent part of a script that doesn't exist.
See, I wondered if it had something to do with when he fired his weapon, because he seemed to be a bit touchy about that subject, and so maybe he fired, like, when he shouldn't have, and that, I mean, that can often be a reason for, transfer.
Well, we got 15 minutes left, so let's talk about that. All right, so let's bring this together now. Your observation, I think, is directly linked to a major flaw in this movie. This is a movie that if David Fincher ran by this group, we would hand the script back to him and we would ask him to edit it. Any guess as to what the major flaw is in the script of 7? And the hint is that it's clearly a flaw because you actually identified it without even knowing you identified it, because I think it was like the first thing you brought up. Remember the first thing about 40 minutes ago, 45 minutes ago, that you actually brought up in terms of behavior that interested you.
Like I brought up so many things.
I know, well, yeah, we talk a lot.
About Mills?
Huh?
About Mills?
Yeah, it was actually, no, we started out with John Doe. Remember
Like the
John
time
Doe?
frame in which he committed all this?
Time, yeah, well, more specifically, yeah, go with that.
So just like the energy and like the planning that required, like going on for a whole year
Yeah,
for
over a
one
year,
murder
yeah.
to.
And because of the way this movie is directed, because of the way this script is written, I don't think anybody here would have any problem with the idea that David Fincher was trying to demonstrate that. Right? That was clearly a mission of his, is to build this character. We have to know how painstaking and how premeditated and how cunning and with what executive function this individual has, which of course executive function does weigh against the idea of schizophrenia, right? And more towards delusional disorder per our previous conversation. But that is a major, major part of this script. The narcissist, if you roll that narcissism here, even if he is not going to be diagnosed with formal narcissistic personality disorder, the narcissist combined with that really makes the ending, unfortunately, not evidence-based. right? So in this case, how long does John Doe know Mills?
Supposedly just a few months.
Not even.
Yeah.
It's actually in the script.
However many weeks.
It's 1 week.
It was, yeah.
It's about a week. This transpires over a week. What
So he wouldn't
is?
have started all of that without this ideal ending in mind.
That's
Yeah.
the point.
That
So
makes sense.
here we go. Here's a person, at the very least we know, has been planning one of the murders for a year,
Yeah.
right? Where he's actually feeding gluttony for a year. That's how meticulous he is. It's also reasonable to assume that once gluttony is killed, that he's going to take even more care with the second murder. Because if you're going to mess up with number one, you should always redo that. The second murder is going to take a little bit more care. Third murder, even more than that. Therefore, with the final two murders, right, with regard to envy and wrath, number 6 and 7, what is the likelihood he is going to allow his whole plan, his legacy, to be built on someone that he knows for a week?
Yeah.
0 chance.
Could you have argued maybe that, like, because he thinks that all of this is coming from God, that he has so much trust that God will reveal the perfect thing in time?
Potential. So what you're saying there is that the primary psychotic process overwhelms the narcissism
Right.
and that need for legacy. And the
And
chance
he's
that
just
it's
so
gonna-
sure that the legacy will come together.
Because of his delusion.
Yeah.
Sure, that's one alternative, but there's another two.
It's like he could be super impulsive, like or the primary move with bipolar disorder, like it was just kind of impulse decision making, so that kind of led him to do the last 2 murders.
So
Yeah.
again, maybe he's becoming unhinged. Maybe as he's getting to that 7th and final murder, the stress is resulting in exacerbation of symptoms, including impulsivity, which then explains why he would chance his entire legacy on a person.
Well, he also says specifically, like, you've made me move up my timeline because, they found his apartment.
So then that counters the impulsivity, but you still don't get the struggle of the narcissist, how his legacy is still based on someone.
Right.
Who he
And
knows
he wouldn't
forever.
have planned that ahead of time. The narcissism would.
So there's still a more viable alternative out there.
Yeah.
I think you alluded to it with regard to, again, I think you alluded to it without knowing you did, with regard to the reasons why he transferred to the new precinct. You had made a comment that believed that it may have been due to his self-report and what happened with regard to that shooting, right?
Yeah.
Can these merge somehow?
I guess you could theorize, and you wouldn't be able to give movie evidence that somehow or another he has heard about that case before, that John Doe had heard about the case or like seen it in some news report or something. Or he's also like the photographer, so he has some inside information, and he might have it in other precincts as well, that he knew about like the preemptive shooting that that Mills shouldn't have shot for, and like ID'd him as a wrathful person
Exactly right.
beforehand.
Right.
And that's why he was in the hallway, like trying to get a picture of him and goad him to kind of self-confirm.
Okay. Right, so I'll work with that. What, from Doe's perspective, would have been the most consistent way to confirm that case in that other city? You had mentioned that, he's a photographer, he may have contacts, he may have heard of it. What's something that makes even more sense? We're talking about the premeditated, executive functioning narcissist.
They want to like punish Brad Pitt for what he had heard that he had done, because it seems like his murders were motivated based on like trying to bring justice.
It could be. There might be more additional motivation for Doe, but we're still kind of up against this issue that there's probably a better reason with regard to John Doe's connection to Mills, other than having heard of his.
Maybe the person he shot was somebody that he like knew personally or something.
keep on going with that. So maybe there's a more personal connection there. Keep on going.
I'm trying to remember, I don't remember the description of the guy he shot very much.
So he couldn't remember the name. What was his name?
Yeah, he didn't know it yet. I think you guys are kind of circling the drain, you just aren't tending it down here.
Yeah.
John Doe was there. Why isn't it reasonable to assume that John Doe also lived in that city and began to conjure this plan, not by finding gluttony, my first victim for number one, but as the true narcissist for his true legacy? Why not start with number 7? That's the one you'd want to know the best. There's no way you'd want to go months, if not years, of planning this, and then come up with number 6 and 7. Of course, these are 2 crimes that were back to back.
I think that would also make more sense for the idea of envy. Like, it just seemed odd that he would have developed envy so quickly when he had like just heard about his wife or something. Like, it seemed like that's something that, especially with his intense like Christian background, I don't think it's like, oh wow, this one woman is just so gorgeous that the first time he sees her, he develops envy. It'd make more sense if he had been tracking Mills for like a year and had been like seeing her to develop this massive amount of envy.
And that's incredibly consistent with what Fincher's intention is to build this character that is incredibly manipulative and is of the most like intense executive planning. Right? And and he does give us a little bit of a clue that this in fact did happen, because Mills is the one that relates that incident. And it does seem that incident was the impetus for his transfer. And Doe may have orchestrated that incident. He may have been, I think Mills referred to the victim as a junkie. Well, I mean, that could have been somebody that John Doe himself manipulated, if not drugged himself.
I thought it was kind of interesting how, speaking of how highly functioning John Doe is and his executive planning, it seemed like in regards to envy specifically, I thought when he murdered Mill's wife, he took 2 lives. So then I thought it was already done, but then the final one ended up being Brad Pitt killing Kevin Spacey. So I thought it was, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I thought it was kind of out of line with how meticulous he was with counting and killing this person with this reason.
I thought about that too. I felt that was like a little bit of a detour from his norm, where it's just like one person. Well, except I guess for the lust one, I mean, he really damaged another person and kind of ruined their life, even though he didn't actually kill them with the man.
Yeah.
So.
I guess somebody who is the narcissist there would just shrug his shoulders and say collateral damage.
But maybe it was also that he was envious of the baby, like envious of the whole idea of family, not just the wife,
Person.
but
So he
the
took that as a
full
blood
family.
entity.
Yeah.
Could be. There's and again, I think the fact that he stalked Mills prior to this film starting makes a ton of sense. There's only one minor flaw to this, and that is, while the incident that took place likely was the impetus of Mills being transferred from that one precinct, there's no guarantee that he would have been transferred to the precinct where John Doe had these murders already started. That's the problem. I mean, leaving one, I think, is straightforward. I think that happened.
Yeah.
But then arriving at the other is a coin flip. Or is it?
Maybe there might have been a history of like transfers between those 2 precincts.
That's one. What else could have been played here? You understand the problem, right? Right? Being transferred out of the one city, I think, is almost 100% certainty.
Maybe he somehow manipulated.
How do you manipulate?
He talks about like funding and corruption, like he's paying people off for information, so.
Who did?
John Doe's paid off.
Yeah, and he seemed to be independently wealthy, they said, so.
So who do you think he paid off?
The head guy, maybe?
Who?
The guy in the beginning who's giving out the assignments.
Could be, Captain.
Yeah.
Could be. Anybody else in your differential here? I have a question for you. And again, this gets to the idea that John Doe gave us, that he'd accelerate his plan. right? Remember that. If they are sitting in front of that box, and remember the scene where Mills is waving that gun, what gets him to finally pull the trigger?
Somerset confirming details of.
He found out she was pregnant, his wife.
Yeah.
That's it. So my question is, if Tracy wasn't pregnant, do you think Mills ever pulls the trigger? He's waving that gun for a long time, and Somerset's getting closer and closer and closer.
I think he would have.
Yeah?
I think he still would have done it.
Think so? Anybody?
Well, if their marriage was actually unhappy, and
I don't have it with me, and I could post it on Instagram, but I actually have the timeline of how many seconds he's waving that gun, and how many seconds he takes to pull that trigger once he hears that his wife was pregnant.
I feel like that was a tipping point. I personally think if she hadn't been.
Again, so there's no right answer. I mean,
Yeah.
it's only an impression. But who's implicated in this then? Who ensures that Tracy keeps that baby in the acceleration of this plan?
Somerset.
But Somerset was supposed to have retired by this point. So, like, he's not retiring. So I feel like he wouldn't have tried to involve Somerset if, like, there was hints that Somerset would have already been retired by. Like, he moved it up. So, like, in his ideal world, it would have happened later even than that, and Somerset definitely would have been retired. Or are you saying, like, he knows that Somerset will stay on as long as this case is happening?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Somerset's retirement was a ruse. Now, remember, Somerset's view of humanity is congruent to, of all people, John Doe's. And I think I think it may have been the final line in the movie that he says humanity is worth saving. And I think that's just a lie to get him to separate himself from his partner, John Doe. Remember, Somerset would have been in the perfect position to ensure the transfer. And he talks about how he's the one who brings up that a lot of people who are paid off are cops, and they pay us and they pay well. He's the one who talks to the FBI and gets stuff illegally in that library. So we see a glimpse of his character, and I think on the surface this looks like any other crime drama where you have the savvy cop, the savvy detective. But when you begin to read between the lines here, his doing that really paints him as the person who, if there was a partner, he has to be considered. Then you add in the fact, as again you brought up, that his view of humanity happens to be similar to, of all people, John Doe, and that somebody would have had to manipulate Mills getting to that precinct. And then the final conclusion is that, if you believe that Mills would not have pulled the trigger unless Tracy were pregnant, then the person that ensured this was going to happen, even though they didn't foresee this, it was not part of their overall plan, hence the comment about accelerating things, was Somerset. He made sure that they had that safety net.
I feel like that would have been good acting on John Doe's part when he was like, oh, he didn't know. Like, if they were really partners, I think Somerset would have communicated that she hadn't told him yet. And it seemed like a pretty genuine reaction of, like, oh, you didn't know.
It could be.
I don't know.
It could be. The other thing, too, remember when John Doe gives himself up and he walks into that precinct, who's the first person he sees, and what does he say to him?
I thought it was Mills. No?
Somerset. He says, I know you.
Oh.
Check out that scene.
Yeah, you're right.
He
You're
smiles,
right.
I know you.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So anyway, the teaching point here, again, this is all conspiracy theory built on the idea that if John Doe has the diagnosis we believe he has, it is not evidence-based. It is simply not that he would have allowed his ultimate plan, the pinnacle of his plan, that is the serial murder of both envy and wrath, to be founded on someone he knows for only a week. Right? That's where all of this comes from. It doesn't allow us to discuss in our final couple of minutes the teaching point that the individual with psychopathy does not fit the stereotype we think of when we think of the antisocial personality. One of the differentiating qualities that is a trait of the psychopath that is not found in the DSM criteria for the antisocial personality is the charismatic individual as well as the parasitic lifestyle. These individuals are con people, and they can be very charismatic, and they can be right under our noses and we don't know it. And that's Somerset. And we trusted this guy for a full, hour and 50 minutes. But if he is the serial killer we think he is, then boy, does it really reinforce that notion of the psychopath. All those signs and symptoms that would define the antisocial personality, but more, including the very charismatic nature, of his personality and how he put it over on us. Right? So that's the main teaching point as a result of all of this. Okay? So from here we'll sign off. That is it for 7, and we'll see everybody back in about a half an hour, right, to discuss our Disney film.